Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Strength Game Podcast. I'm your host, Nick O'Brien, and this is episode number 119. The Strength Game is a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing all things physical culture with the coaches, athletes, iron enthusiasts, and experts deeply embedded in the strength game on both sides of the profession, both as coaches and as competitive athletes. I want to thank everyone who has subscribed to the show, who has provided feedback, has liked, shared, and commented, and given us suggestions for future guests. All your support allows us to continue to bring on expert guests and highlight more individuals in the strength game, just like our guests today. I also want to thank our sponsors. Samson Equipment has been providing uncompromising quality for over 40 years. Samson products are long-lasting and made of the highest quality equipment on the market. Each project is built from the ground up with the ability to customize every need. The team at Samson focuses on developing the highest quality relationships with their customers, in addition to providing them unparalleled quality in every piece of equipment bearing the Samson name. Learn more about Samson's professional weight room solutions and the Samson standard at samsonequipment.com. Also want to thank our sponsor, Cerberus Strength. Cerberus is an organization that puts the athlete first and actively works towards providing the best quality gear at an affordable price. Owned and operated by active lifters, Cerberus has quickly evolved into a global brand symbolizing quality and trust. If you're in the market for the highest quality strength conditioning gear and equipment, be sure to check out cerberusstrength.com and use promo code strength_game to receive an extra 10% off your next order. Also want to thank our sponsor, Sport Kilt. Born in Scotland and stitched in America, Sport Kilt offers the highest quality custom kilts and accessories. Every Sport Kilt is made in the USA of machine washable polyester blend fabric, offering an alternative to the traditional heavy wool kilt. Sport Kilt products are made for people who like to be active and make a statement while they train, compete, play, and adventure. Check out the No Pants All Glory selection of kilts and shop the best collection of high-quality, American-made sport kilts and accessories at sportkilt.com and use promo code TSG to receive an extra 10% off your next order. And in this week's episode, I am joined by Nat Sauberan. Nat is the Assistant Director of Athletic Performance at Gardner-Webb University, where he works with the men's and women's basketball and wrestling programs, in addition to supervising the intern coach over men's soccer. Before Gardner-Webb, Sauberan was the head football strength conditioning coach at Morehead State University for one season. He served as a graduate assistant coach at Belhaven University for 2 years, from 2021 to 2023, where he worked with the Blazers football, men's basketball, men's and women's soccer, and track and field programs. Sauberan got his coaching career started as a strength conditioning intern at Yale University in 2021 and has also completed internships with the University of Pittsburgh's football program as a sports science intern and paid intern at Sanford Power in Bismarck, North Dakota. Sauberan is an avid lifter and enjoys traveling and finding cool places to eat with his wife and dog when he is not training in the weight room. He has competed in classic physique bodybuilding and continues to train with the goal of learning to dunk a basketball. I'm excited to have him on the show today. So with all that said, let's get in the game with Nat Sauberan. What's going on, everybody? Today we've got Coach Nat Sauberan on the show. How you doing today, Coach?
Doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Good. Hey, we got chatting a little bit before. Right now, as we record this, this is prime summertime, and you got a little bit of downtime. So I'm glad we got to connect. I know we'll touch on a little bit like why your summer is kind of pretty cool based off the teams that you're currently working with over there at Gardner-Webb, but before we kind of get into the X's and O's and all the stuff that you're doing with those teams, kind of want to start in the beginning, how you really got started in the strength game, the sports you played growing up, kind of leading into what you do day to day for yourself to train and stay active.
Yeah, so in high school, I was your classic football wrestling track athlete. I got really, really bored if I didn't have a sport that I was in. I specifically remember in junior high saying, I'm never going to run track. What's the fun in running around in circles? Why would anyone do that? And then high school came around, and as soon as spring came around, wrestling was done. I was bored to tears. So figured I'd run track there. Did that throughout high school. Track, ironically enough, was probably my best sport. Wound up being a state medalist in the 100 meter there and in the state finals in the 200-meter dash also. But I couldn't stay healthy throughout high school. And that kind of ignited the passion for strength and conditioning. Just wondering, there's got to be some way to prevent this or at least minimize the severity of any of injuries. So after I broke my ankle in end of my junior year, had to have surgery on that, missed my senior year of football. And that was when I really said, you know what, I'm going to go all in on the strength and conditioning thing in college. Went to Iowa State University, where I got my bachelor's in kinesiology and health. Specific emphasis was exercise science, and did that for 4 years. After that, went and interned at Yale University. Had a really good time there, learning the ins and outs of strength and conditioning. Went to Sanford Power after that, which is the branch of Sanford Health in North Dakota. So I worked for them, then got in touch with Coach Wood through Twitter. Can't thank Coach Wood enough. So if he was listening to this, thank you again for that. He hired me on as a GA at Belhaven. In between my couple of years as a GA at Belhaven, I did a sports science internship up at the University of Pittsburgh under Patrick Peterson, who's now with Rutgers football and doing great things there. Once football at Belhaven was done, I got hired on by Morehead State to be an assistant strength and conditioning coach. And within a short period of time there, they decided I was the perfect fit for them to be their head of football strength and conditioning. So I did that. And then Gardner-Webb came calling in December of this past year and decided it was time to make that transition.
Nice. Well, it's pretty, seems like a pretty smooth transition kind of going through. Like there's not a lot of whole people probably my age, like being like mid-30s at this point, where right out of high school you knew what you wanted to do in strength conditioning, like, and then you knew you wanted to do it at the college level. It's kind of interesting now that a lot more coaches like yourself that are kind of newer to the profession in like their first couple spots or first couple years too, like that's coming out of high school. You're like, I'm going to school to be a strength conditioning coach. Like this is what I want to do. So you kind of have, I don't want to say an easier roadmap, but you kind of have a little bit more guidance of like, hey, this is where other coaches have been being successful. These are maybe some of the pitfalls that they had in their first 10 years. Like I can avoid some of those things because, hey, if I start interning, if I start getting in the weight room my freshman year of college, like it's a lot better position than some of these other coaches that maybe didn't start until their first GA position. So it's, I mean, the profession is definitely changing. It's kind of in a great trajectory if people are starting sooner and sooner. What from that stop, like you were involved with football for a lot of those places, like a little different now, kind of being removed from football. How's the transition and like kind of touch on the sports you're working with now at Gardner-Webb?
Yeah, so currently I have the men's and women's basketball teams and the wrestling team, and the transition to basketball has been really, really smooth. Have some great coaches here with Coach Luther with men's basketball and Coach Scott Merritt with women's basketball. They've got some great staffs with them, and so really, really enjoyed that. But the transition was smooth for me because that was always one of the sports I had my eye on. You always want to see athletes perform at their peak. And I can't say there's many sports where there can just be the excitement in the room when someone throws down a dunk or hits a 3-pointer from the logo. Those just electric moments. And so that was one of those where kind of trying to get the ins and outs of how to train basketball teams before actually stepping into that role paid off there. And I had men's basketball at Belhaven when I was a GA. So I did that for a couple years. Interned at Yale, worked with a couple basketball players there, helped pretty heavily with the basketball teams at Morehead State, both men and women there. And the men made the NCAA tournament. And played Illinois close till halftime, and then wheels kind of fell apart there at the end. But have experience with high level basketball teams, and so that really smoothed the transition. Being able to sit down with the coach and say, "Hey, I've done this before. I'm not brand new to the sport of basketball." So that really helped there, and then just being able to build that relationship with the players. There's a lot of times, I think, people that wind up in basketball, it's a holdover until another football position is how some people treat it, especially when you're not a Power Five school. A lot of times you wind up, all right, this sport coach wants someone to be able to try with basketball. We'll just take our second or third football guy and have them hold that spot. And so being able to say, I'm not interested in football right now. I'm just purely here for you guys. And then them seeing, hey, I'm making training that is going to translate to their sport. Because again, a lot of times they're used to, we're going to get in the weight room, we're going to squat, bench, deadlift, and maybe think about some tempo runs like a couple weeks before first practice begins. And they innately shut down at that thought. I think basketball has a tenuous relationship with the weight room, just from a 30,000-foot view, because they take a look at the strength coach that they have, and usually it's a shorter, balding white guy that really likes strength sports and really likes football. And they take a look at that and say, that's not what the usual basketball player looks like, and that's not usually what makes them successful. The reasons that your NFL offensive lineman is successful is not the reasons that Steph Curry is successful in the NBA, right? And so they take a look at that, and just how you communicate that message can make a world of difference. And so the first thing for the basketball teams that I said was, look, I train a specific way because I love the weight room. How I train personally and how I train you are two very different things. And it puts their mind at ease, because now they're not worried about, well, if my coach really likes lifting weights, does that mean we're just going to do everything that he does in his own personal training because he enjoys that? And that really puts their mind at ease. Like, I'm going to get quality training out of that. And then you actually put emphasis on the movements that I think football's kind of underutilized. I think football's kind of overvalued the weight room from a training perspective. Obviously, it's a collision sport, right? You need some muscle mass, but they probably overvalued just the lifting aspect and undervalue kind of the science and data behind things with making those decisions. And so one of the biggest things for getting the buy-ins of the basketball teams here was something as simple as every time we train, we're going to use the jump mat in some capacity. Every time we train, we just got a dasher system. We're going to be using that in some capacity. And so they actually see their metrics going up and things that's much more easily understood for them as to how it's going to help them with sport. They say, oh, my jump is going up here. And I walk them through, all right, here's how this jump differs from this jump, what it's telling me different, how it's going to influence me programming for you. And they just wind up buying in. And I had two very bought in basketball teams here at Gardner-Webb. And I know that's not always the case with basketball programs and their relationship with strength and conditioning. And it's a two-way street, because they need to buy into what you're saying, and you need to actually make an effort to get to know them and explain to them, like, hey, here's why this matters for you. And so that's the biggest thing that was helped me shift the transition from football to basketball, was kind of really emphasizing those things.
No, that's a great point. I think that kind of goes by the wayside a lot. Oftentimes, like, what you're trying to do with your athletes, like, it needs to be relatable to their sport, and they need to kind of buy into it in a sense. And it's more so like buying into like what you're going to do and having trust in that you're not going to kind of put your biases and put your favorite things like within a program. You're looking out for their best interest and like what actually is going to give them the best performance on the court, put them in the most opportune position to be successful. And it's not a cookie cutter program where it's coming from another sport where you're just kind of coaching them hard, because like you said, like we all see it with football and some of those contact and collision sports, it's a little bit easier to be bought into the weight room when like mass is important, like with heavy strength numbers is important. We start getting to basketball and you start getting some like more skill-based sports where you don't necessarily need to be the biggest person. You're not punching a guy like in the chest every single play. You have to have some finesse to it, and they need to understand. Well, they want to understand that you know exactly what it takes for them to be successful too. If you don't really give them the chance to get to know them or try to understand their sport, if it's a sport like maybe you didn't play as often or play at all, like you really do need to kind of be invested more and be at more practices and see exactly like how they move and what kind of makes these players tick and what drives them. That's a good point. I don't know if it's easier necessarily, like to go from a football program to go to three programs that have 20 plus players on it. Because some wrestling programs keep a lot of guys, but basketball, you're probably looking at under 20. So you have like a small football team just spread across three different sports now. So how is that? Like, do you feel like now, like you have three sports, but is it a little bit easier to kind of have those one-on-one interactions because it's fewer, or does it make it just as difficult because now you're kind of dealing with three different schedules?
Honestly, it probably does make it easier because if I'm not with one sport, I'm with the other sport, and you add up that quality time over time, which sounds it doesn't that doesn't sound profound. Like you need to take time to do this, but I think a lot of times when we think about building relationships with the athletes, like we're talking about, they're they're not innately wired to just trust right off the bat. They take a look at things and they got to understand and process it through on their own timeline. And when you try to rush that timeline as a coach, you're just setting up to fracture that relationship at some point. You're going to turn them away faster than if you just take a little bit more of a hands off approach and just have some short one on one, almost like tidbits at a time. You got an athlete that doesn't necessarily want to open up, telling them to hurt, hey, let's rush the process because we want to be really, really good and win every game this next year. That sounds great in theory, but it doesn't work in reality. They're all on their own individual timelines. And so being able to let that happen naturally is very, very critical. And then the other thing I did, when you talk about, all right, how do we add up those relationships over time with all three different sports? I talked with our basketball coaches and they agreed to let me have the athletes in some capacity every single weekday of the week. And so I actually train both basketball teams Monday through Friday. It's between 35 to 45 minutes a session, but you can do so much more relationship wise just by having a higher frequency point of contact with the athlete than I've only got to see coach twice this week for an hour at weights, and then he wasn't at practice and he wasn't at games, et cetera, et cetera. They buy in more because now you're a more familiar figure to them. It's far more of a relationship where I can say, how are you doing today? Because you're not the same as you were yesterday, or you're really chipper today. How was yesterday for you? Did you do well on your test? Like what's going on there? And that really plays a huge factor that I think is underrated in that is just having those higher frequency points of contact.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg thing when you start looking at strength coaches and the ones that are in maybe those Olympic sports that have four, five, six, seven teams versus like some of these kind of Power Five schools that have like a staff of five that work with football, or you're only working basketball, or you only have maybe an off season and in season sport where you have the ability and like the time available to go out to practice and kind of have more frequency either in the weight room or part of warm ups and stuff like that. And not every school is ever going to be able to do that. So you wonder if it's like, well, if it's just happenstance, like I'm there all the time, like I could see him on the bad days, I could see him on the good days, I can kind of see him on the regular days. Like you feel like when you have multiple teams, like maybe you have a small facility, you're kind of just factory workers pumping them out. And we sit here and talk about how important those relationships are to actually building in buy-in rather than just writing whatever program on the board and just kind of having people mindlessly like do it just to get physically better with no other benefits, and players either bought in or not bought in or half-assing it or doing way too much. Like it's the problem you see with a lot of college athletics at this point. Like we want to build those relationships, but strength coaches don't really have time if you're having six teams and you're just on the floor, clock after clock. How it's hard to create consistent relationships like you talk about 5 days a week for just even like just to say hi. Can't really do that when you're only seeing a cheer team 2 days a week at 7 a.m. when they're not really excited to be there. And then half of them are missing Thursday because of makeups. And then now they have a competition. You don't see them until 2 weeks later. Like it's hard to develop those relationships and kind of ask them to do hard things in the weight room when you're not really a familiar face.
Mhm.
So it's a weird kind of catch 22 when we talk about like how important those relationships are to kind of getting those like player buy-ins. Like how like working with multiple teams like at some of your previous spots, like at Belhaven, like you assist with football, you had multiple teams that you were working with on top of your GA. Like, do you see a difference like now working with your three programs like in a full-time capacity versus when you had multiple teams? Like, do you like looking back see it a little bit more difficult to build that buy-in and have relationships when you're kind of pulled in so many directions and have so many athletes?
Oh, 100% there's a difference. And, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said how much more difficult it is than to ask them to do hard things when you're not a consistent face around. I look back at my time as a GA at Belhaven, and there were some teams where I couldn't be at their practice. I had other lift, or I had another sport where I had to be at their practice to do a warm up or conditioning or one of those kind of things. And then I look back and I'm like, well, no wonder I never really got the buy-in I was expecting from this team. I was never around. It's the same way I think about, all right, if I was in their shoes, or I even think about it in terms of this, if you're working with a sport coach and if you saw them 2 times a week for like 50 minutes, like your average strength session, right? How much would you actually really build a rapport and connect with them and buy into everything that they want you to do and you want them to do? Probably a pretty minimal chance of that for the exact same reasons. But as strength coaches, I think sometimes we kind of devalue that and just look at our position as, well, we're a coach. They should know that they got to come in and work hard regardless of the personal relationship. And I'm not saying that's not wrong, because the athlete should want to come in and work hard every time. The athlete should give their full effort. The athlete should always want to do what it takes to maximize to win. But I like to say you can be 100% right about something and not get a behavior change. And normally it comes down to something like that. Like you don't have the relationship with them, or you haven't built them up to a point where they can actually handle doing something ridiculously hard that you're asking them to do. And you got to build not only the physical tools up for them, but we like to think about mental toughness as this huge component of sport. We almost value mental toughness more than we value actual sport skill itself at some points in time. But we never actually do anything to kind of train that on our end. And so something as simple as, if we're having a moderately difficult session, maybe we're doing trap bar deadlift to kind of potentiate the jumps that we're going to do. Maybe we're doing our curvilinear sprints around the 3-point line or the free throw line. You got to brace your partner. You explicitly stating to the athlete, hey, all right, I'm going to pair you up with this person that is way faster than you are. You got to decide now, how are you going to handle that? Or the other way around, like you're going to beat them. It's going to happen. There's no way on earth it doesn't. How are you going to handle actually winning all those reps? Are you still going to slow up at the end just because you're ahead by a lot? Or are you actually going to make the choice that you just want to do the best that you can and you do that? And sometimes you pit them up and it's a fairly equal matchup. It's a 50-50 shot. And so now you've put them explicitly in positions along that mental side where you should win this matchup. So now you have experience being the aggressor in that situation. You're probably going to lose this matchup. Now you have experience. It's kind of getting your teeth kicked in when you don't really want it to. And then you put them in a equal opportunity game there. Like you might win, you might lose. Who knows at this point? And so now you've kind of experienced the gamut of what it's like physically being across all three of those situations. And it's not a one of one thing, like, oh, if you handle your curving your sprint competition rep really, really well, and someone's egging you on in the game, that it's going to translate. Like, I think we need to be careful just assuming things translate as well as they do with that stuff. But the mental aspect of, you've already been in situations where you're supposed to be in those, more practice at that doesn't hurt. And so that builds that buy-in a lot too, because now they can contextualize it. And even if the rep itself isn't something where they're explicitly going to remember that later on, they have your voice saying, you know what, you're probably going to lose this one. You're probably going to win this one, something like that. That's the part where now, if we translate it to, all right, you got to do something hard in a game scenario for the school so that we win the game. That's probably something they can draw on. Like, you know what, I got to do this to the best of my ability, win, lose, or draw. And then they can extrapolate that to all those different situations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. Like those three different situations, oftentimes I feel like a lot of the easy way to do it, and like if you don't really think about it purposefully, you try to put people that are kind of evenly matched against each other. And because innately it's like, oh, well, it's going to be competitive. Like, oh, this person runs a 4.6, this person runs a 4.61. All right, well, if we're going to push them, let's put them against each other. But that's not always the situation you're going to find yourself in. Like the same thing you talk about, like Morehead State makes the NCAA tournament, and Illinois is probably a 3 or 4 seed when you guys get them. So it's a tough matchup. So if you don't put your team in some of those situations where, hey, we're going to be behind, maybe it's kind of a David Goliath sort of setting. It's like, all right, let's just put all the cards on the table and see if we can do it. All right, can you also play with the lead? Can you play behind? Like these are situational things that during practices for any sport, coaches put into play. So why as strength coaches can we not kind of put them in those situations and still kind of have the same like training effect and like the X's and O's of like the program, but just have it a little bit more purpose driven where you're putting some pressure on them in a different way and kind of putting the strength conditioning into context so that they can kind of relate it back over to a different situation they're going to end up dealing with in their sport of choice. So that's a good point. Like, and you're right too. Like it's causation and correlation, like we know, but it's not going to prove. It's not a 1-for-1 perfect setting where like A plus B equals C every single time. But to your point, like getting more practice, getting more reps at that is not going to hurt, because I mean, everything we're going to do in the weight room has some psychological effect to it. And there's a mental toughness kind of component if you're challenging yourself, even if it's through a physical like attribute like lifting. But if you kind of even push that envelope a little bit more, the physical traits are going to follow suit. Like they're going to always be innately there, because that's what we coach in the weight room. So that's a good point. Hey, so when you actually had to kind of jump up and get into like your position, you started moving your way from an internship role to a GA position to kind of leading for yourself, like what were kind of some of those big challenges? Because as an intern, depends on where you're at, or like what kind of the program is or what your responsibilities do. Oftentimes, if it's a good program, you're going to earn a little bit more responsibility and have the opportunity to maybe coach some more athletes or have a position group or have like more tasks within it. As a GA, it depends on where you're at. Sometimes you might just have full teams if you're certified, or you're in kind of an assistant role. And then, but once you're on full time, like you have teams with whether or not you have direct oversight or like you're calling all the shots. What were some of maybe those big challenges that you kind of did or had to go through to get to your like position now, and then kind of calling all the shots and maybe not having to run your program through everybody else? Like, how do you kind of reflect and validate and kind of look back on your own programming when you don't have someone where you're kind of checking everything you're doing before you actually implement it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me looking back on it, if there was one lesson I wish I understood sooner in all of this, it's you have to get your tone in check. If your tone is not in check, I'll repeat what I said earlier on the podcast. You, as a coach, you can be 100% right about something and not yield the desired behavior change because they just didn't listen to you because you didn't match the tone for it. The whole right message, wrong messenger concept is 100% real. And I want to talk about Coach Wood again there because he was someone that really prepared me for the spots that I'm in. Is his biggest criticism of me in my time as a GA at Belhaven was he's like, look, you got to take a step back and understand sometimes how what you're saying is actually being perceived, whether it's with the sport coaches, athletes, etc. Like you're not necessarily wrong, but sometimes your tone just overshadows it, right? And I think looking back on it, it's as simple as, do you actually have that relationship with your athlete first, or are you just going into coaching them? And if you're just going right into coaching them and you don't actually have a relationship with them, it doesn't work the same way. There's a very linear order it has to follow in order to work for both your benefit and the athlete's benefit. And that relationship has to be there first. And so that was a huge thing for me. Was the way I came in to having the basketballs and the wrestling team here at Gardner-Webb was very different than how I went into having my teams as a graduate assistant at Belhaven. If I had to contrast the differences at Belhaven, like I said, I just went into being a coach first. Like, you know what? If I know what I'm doing here coaching wise, they should want to do this. They should see that. And if they're not on board with that, then just jump off the ship now because it's not going to get better over time, right? Versus here at Gardner-Webb, like, all right, they've all had different strength and conditioning experiences, whether they were transfer in, whether they had that in high school, whether they're just not very confident in the weight room. Let's kind of keep on doing what we're supposed to be doing strength and conditioning wise, but let's put a greater emphasis on actually talking with them and having those kind of fun moments throughout that kind of lessen the seriousness of it. And I think sometimes as strength and conditioning coaches, we kind of overvalue the serious aspect of strength and conditioning. It's the same as any other thing. If you think about like the inverted U graph, there's a perfect amount of stimulation, right? Anything less, they're bored to tears. Anything more, they're just overstimulated and they can't handle it. And fun is the same amount, right? When you're doing strength and conditioning, it's not, it's just silly time. Nothing is serious. Nothing gets done. Like there is a level of seriousness to it, but it's a lot lower than you think it is when you're working with 18 to 21-year-olds that you really want to develop so that by the time they're a junior and senior, they're really contributing. And by that point, when you've invested enough in the relationship, now you really can ask them to do the hard things that they need to be done. And I think a lot of times, I'm trying to remember who said this, but when it comes to athletes and it comes to their training, the one that's the most successful is the one that they actually do. You can have the perfect training program, and if the athlete doesn't want to do it and they're not going to give their full effort into it, it really doesn't matter. And so you need to treat strength and conditioning more like an art than a science. Obviously, there's science to it, right? If there wasn't science to it, then this would just be completely subjective opinions as to who top strength and conditioning coaches are. But the best strength and conditioning coaches understand the human aspect. And so, like I said, when I was a GA at Belhaven, I wish I understood the human aspect more. And that was something that Coach Wood got on me enough times that it really shifted how I coached over time. So when I got to Morehead State, I originally wasn't going to have football. I was going to take some of the other teams as an assistant. I mean, a couple of weeks there, head guy, his name's Dylan Janung, who had all the stuff there. Great guy, great coach at keeping the strength staff united and together. He was like, I think you should take over football. He was like, I think this would be a good fit. And so they got that process done. And it was a night and day difference in terms of how I went with the athletes there too. Far more relationship based, and you still throw them solid strength and conditioning programming, but you emphasize that relational aspect more. And then that just feeds into what you're able to do. And so if you're viewing it from a selfish aspect, it's like, all right, even if you don't necessarily think about it just from a relationships aspect, you got to think about it as how am I actually going to maximize what am I doing strength and conditioning wise? And that's always going to be from building that relationship and showing them, hey, I actually care about you as a person. We can talk about other things besides athletics and what you're going to lift in the weight room today. And then so you get to something later on, it's not, you're not Coach Nat or Coach Nick just shouting out sets and reps for them to do. They know you're coming from a place where you actually care about them, and what you're asking them to do, even if it may be really difficult, is really going to pay off for them in the long run because you're that figure to them. Like, hey, he cares as a person.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like athletes, I mean, there's that old quote, like they don't care how much you know, they only care how much you actually care about them. And it's important when you care about them more than just like how they are as an athlete and like how you're coaching them, and developing that relationship is huge. It's it's one thing that I always thought about, like with people that end up like jumping from program to program, it's hard to sit there and like develop a relationship. And after being at like some stops for a longer period of time, where like you've been there for like 3 years and now you know every player on the team except for the new ones incoming, like it's easier to develop the relationship with the other players because the 75% that you retain, that you already developed a relationship before, like they're kind of enveloping the new ones coming in. So they're like, no, just you'll get bought into like Coach Nick eventually. Like it'll take a little bit, but it speeds it up a little bit because you have kind of all the buy-in from the players you're working with. When you come in to a new program and no one knows who you are, you're the new person, and it takes a little bit more. And like you said, you can't rush that process, and you really have to show them that it can't always be just serious. There's going to be times where we kind of have to buckle down, and this is an important thing, and like maybe these are my non-negotiables right here. But there should be moments in time where you can have conversations that aren't necessarily driven by the weight room or like what's on the bar or what the next exercise looks like. There's got to be kind of breaks in it so they can see that you're more than just a coach. Like they need to see a slight personal side of it too, because if you're not the first one to initiate and open up, you're going to have I'm hard pressed to see athletes that are just going to like put down the walls and let you kind of come in and dictate stuff when you're not at least the first one sharing. I mean, anybody that goes to any like sort of like meeting or therapy or anything like that, like the first person that shares is the person kind of leading the meeting. Like, because it opens everybody else up. As a coach, the same thing. If you want to build that trust with the athletes, you have to kind of openly share those things before you can expect anybody else to be bought in and follow you to some of those difficult places you're going to have to go. Hey, so like talking about like not rushing the process and everything, like now that you're kind of going into year two, like what are kind of the things that maybe you're evaluating a little bit more and you like maybe kind of want to work towards, because this is unique for you. This is like your off time period. So like going into year two, like what are maybe some of like the training goals, some of the things that you weren't able to kind of instill that first year, that now having a little bit more of a feel for the program, like being involved with the team and the coaching staff more, like what can you do now in year two that was probably a little bit too much on the plate to ask for in the first year?
The first thing that comes to mind is individualized needs programming. And so we have a jump mat here. I'm hoping to get some force plates here at some time, but for now, I've got the just jump mat. But what I did for the semester when I came in was I logged all their numbers on the jumps that they've done. And I just took the top 3 jumps for each day. And so using the sports science stuff that I learned from Patrick Peterson up at Pittsburgh, who's now at Rutgers, able to use our studio to create trend lines and some box plots there to be able to evaluate, all right, what does each athlete need some more specific work at, right? Is that all the programming that you do right off the bat, even though it's specific to the sport, like basketball, for example, it's generalized for each individual athlete, as we have to think of volume and intensity and all these other characteristics as these unique traits where there is a nicer balance for the athlete. it's up to us to be able to understand the data and how to figure out what they need the most work at. And so with the jumps, for example, we run through vertical jumps, a hands-on hip, counter movement jump, the 4-jump test. I always call it the bounce test because that always translates better for them than any kind of, oh, we're testing RSI here. It's like, not try to be bouncy. Like, then they understand it. Then they get the goal of it a lot quicker. And then an approach jump. And so by taking, I think it would have been like 4 months of data by that time and creating those trend lines and all right, here's our deviations on each day, here's our median, et cetera, et cetera. I have a much clearer picture as to what each athlete needs a little bit, maybe a little bit more volume of at this thing, maybe a little bit more intensity at this thing. Maybe they need to kind of shift training emphasis a little bit more just because I was patient and let the data build out. I think one of the most memorable things Pat said to me, Pitt, was he was talking about when he came in and took over and really started building up the data. He was like, you got to wait longer than you think to actually use the data. And that stood out because at the time, not having any experience with sports science, when I did that, it's like the first thing in my head is like, oh, you got to prove your value. You got to be able to just you do this one test and boom, this athlete needs this. Boom, this athlete needs this. And he's like, no, you got to be patient with it because time's your friend on that. So that was the thing that really stood out to me that I try to apply here. And so the packets that I gave each athlete for the summer up until they're back on campus training with us, I'm hoping it yields more buy-in for them because I was able to start doing the individual training emphasis for them. And so I've got a plan where our basketball athletes who need a little bit more absolute strength, they're doing a little bit more lifting than everybody else. We got some of our basketball athletes where they need a little bit more reactive strength. They're doing less lifting and doing more of the plyos. We've got some of our athletes where it's the plyos at speed. So think your approach jump, being able to convert their momentum into different directions. They've got a lot more change of direction and high speed plyometric type movement in order to adapt to that. And then hands on hips usually is a little bit more of just lower body power type of emphasis. So they have a little bit better timing and synchronization with the upper body. It's just the purely lower body aspect. They've kind of got a blend of all three there. And so what I'm hoping is when we reconvene after this break is done, that they'll have trained more frequently than they would have over past summers because, hey, this program is specific to me and what I need athletically. This isn't just, yep, here, cookie cutter plan, here, take it, do it, and hope that it gets you better athletically. Now that it's individualized, there's much more buy-in. And that was something where I took the time to meet with each of them at the end of the spring semester here and went over all their numbers and their graphs and the results and said, here's what you need to work on athletically. And then kind of like, it was like taking the scales off the eyes moment for them. Like, oh, wow, the stuff that we're doing, this actually makes a difference in terms of how I'm able to play it because you paint the game scenarios for them. Like, you need more of this to be successful in this type of situation. And then fitting the puzzle pieces together for themselves, which is a huge, huge part. This is what I need to do to actually get better at basketball athletically. Because I can't, as much as I want to, I can't make them see the value in strength and conditioning, right? They have to come to that at their own point in time. And so by being that figure over the semester, explaining what we're doing and being patient with that, and not getting overly frustrated, like, why don't they see it? Why can't they do that? Now they're starting to see it. And now that they're taking ownership of it, that's really where the results come in. Because I think one of the things for me that really grinds my gears in strength and conditioning, maybe my number one pet peeve, is when you have a coach that does nothing but preach, we're going to be super mentally tough. We're going to have athletes that do everything the right way. They're going to want to do it 100% of the time. And then they do nothing but throw extrinsic motivational tactics at them. It's like, all right, walk again. I know that things aren't a one-of-one comparison, right? But walk me through the process where doing nothing but extrinsically motivated activities and coaching styles is going to yield an intrinsically motivated athlete. Like help me cross that bridge. And I have yet to find anyone that can super explain that to me. And I think it's because a lot of times, again, we just assume a lot of things translate that don't actually translate. And I think a lot of times it pains the coach to admit that they have to wait for the athlete to really buy into what they're doing and not the other way around. It is a waiting game. They might never come around. That's part of the thing that I think scares coaches with admitting that the intrinsic part is huge, and you have to kind of let people figure that out along the way. Is they're right. They might not ever get there, but you're not going to do it through a whole bunch of extrinsically motivated tactics. And we talked about beforehand, at best, with those extrinsically motivated tactics, the research is pretty clear that authoritarian styles of leadership result in worse play later on. They've done studies on that. And you need to be equal parts loving and demanding as a coach and not just purely demanding. And if that relationship is off, then you're not ever going to get out of them what you want to get out of them. And they're also not going to be the kind of athlete that you want them to be, where they're super intrinsically motivated to accomplish that. And so taking a little bit more slower approach, and it's not necessarily a nihilistic approach, like nothing I do matters kind of deal, but it's far more understanding like the athlete's the one guiding this process, not us as the coaches.
No, that's a good point. It's you got to wait for that kind of click moment where the athlete is like really driven by it, and each of them is gonna have a different process. They're gonna have a different timeline. Something else is gonna like actually get it to click, whether it's a movement or like we're kind of talking about where it's kind of the whole strength and conditioning process of like, hey, how does this translate over to the thing I enjoy doing, the thing that I'm good at, the thing I excel at? Like, why am I doing this? Oh, because this is actually helping. This is actually getting me to the place that I want to be. And I think we're a product of our own kind of design when it comes to like some of these big sports. And like we talk about extrinsic motivation, you put strength coaches in a position where they're tied in with a head coach, and a head coach is tied in with wins or losses. So the strength coach's job is to kind of fulfill that kind of culture piece, the person that actually like carries out the head coach's mission when it comes to the weight room. And as we know, when you're talking about basketball, football, even baseball nowadays, and like Power Five schools, like we get to see them a lot more often in the off season than a sport coach does. So when your job is on the line, you're getting paid high money, and you're kind of really at that point in time, the off season, you're the head coach and in a lot of sense of the word, because they're going to see you more often than their head sport coach, which is on the road recruiting, doing other stuff, and then it's handcuffed by the NCAA to do coaching at all. So if your job's on the line and you're kind of the one focal point of it, you're going to do everything you can to kind of make sure that every single kid is bought on board, especially like some of the skill players too, like some of the guys that are going to be like your talented ones that you need there. And it's unfortunate, like, but at the end of the day, some players, like how you coach, it's just not their cup of tea. Like you're never going to reach some of them. And going back to extrinsic motivation and trying to kind of force it down them, it's probably doing the complete polar opposite of what your intention is too. So by just having some time, trying to get bought in, and usually as long as they're not one of those key players where you really need them, it kind of solves itself. And the rest of the players who are bought in, who are self-motivated, who are self-driven, who hold themselves accountable, hold the rest of their teammates accountable, and police themselves, usually they drive those players out. And that's what you hope to do. You don't want to be the person that intervenes with every single thing as the coach, because I tell my players all the time, like if there's a dead part in the play, there's a PK or there's a high stress on the line, you're about to take a shot. If you look over to the sideline and you look for me or you look for your coach for guidance, we're fucked. It's way too late. It's way too late. You should be in that moment. You should know exactly what to do. Like we're there to kind of help you along the way. But when it comes to game time decisions, that's all you as a player. You have to be in that, and that has to come from within, not from any sort of external factor that's driving that decision.
100%. I think you actually lead into another really good part there. I think when we think about training. If you pull the general public on, all right, what's your perception of what a strength coach does on a given day? It's what is it? You're yelling all the time. You're fired up. It's iron fist, law and order. Everything is detailed and done perfectly, etc. But what is sport in and of itself? You think about a basketball game. All right, if your team is shooting over 50% from the field on a given night, that's a great night, right? If you're shooting over 50%, that's 50%. What's happening that other 50%? Nothing but failure, right? And so a lot of times in training, specifically strength and conditioning, we completely remove the failure aspect. And we go back to, all right, putting people explicitly in one of three different positions. All right, well, if we're not even worried about that and we're just focused on everything being perfect, now we don't touch that other component. Like, you're going to fail sometimes. It's like if you get out 70% of the time in Major League Baseball, you're a Hall of Famer probably at the end of your career. So you can teach them the skills on how to actually have failure within training. And I explicitly tell my athletes, like, don't be afraid to fail, because it's expected. If they're good at it right off the bat, we probably don't need to spend as much time training it, right? So if you get it innately, that's awesome. We can find another way that probably exposes you a little bit more towards failure. But again, we don't think about it that way. We're just like detailed. And a lot of times I think as strength and conditioning coaches, there's far too much obsession over, all right, is this plate facing the right way? And less emphasis on actually thinking through, did I put my athletes in a spot where they have to deal with success or failure in the correct physiologic conditions of the sport? Because one of those is going to translate way more than the others. Again, I'll say it, it's not a one of one, but the closer you get to what it actually is, the more it's going to translate. And I have a very hard time buying into the, well, if the plates are facing up the right way, it's going to translate into how they're going to do when they miss a free throw at the end of the game. Like, not the same thing. Not the same thing. And so by explicitly putting them in positions where they're going to fail, you normalize what's happening in sport, and now you're going to normalize their response to it. And one of the things, like with the basketball athletes in particular, they blow a layup in layup lines. What's the normal response for them, right? That's the part I want to be able to coach in on, because how you react there is going to tell me way more how you're going to handle an in-game scenario, because that detail matters more. I disagree completely with the how you do one thing is how you do everything quote. It's just not true. You only have so much bandwidth as a person, and you need to be able to place more emphasis on the details that matter. It's how you wind up with athletes and coaches alike, where I'm sure you can think of some off the top of your head, they are train wrecks off the field. You aspire to be none of what they live and choose to be. Man, they can win some games. They can put some points up. They can do this. And so it kind of gets swept under the rug there. But back to that layup type line scenario, if you're yelling and screaming curse words and berating yourself there, that's not the type of mentally tough athlete that we're looking for, right? Like, you clearly, it bothers you. That's a good thing. That's that intrinsic motivation we're talking about. Now we got to redirect that into a little bit more positive self-talk there that isn't just a display of look how much I care. I think it was Steve Magnus who tweeted out the study where they took athletes and looked at the rate of like positive self-talk and negative self-talk, and there were two very clear outcomes. The more negative self-talk you had, the more those type of situations happen. You performed worse, and you wound up letting that feed into the next thing. Or that positive self-talk, like, hey, I've got all this practice, I'm good, that's one thing, flush it, move on to the next one. They wound up performing better, more consistently, because that's what they've conditioned themselves to do. And so when we place emphasis on those details, we got to make sure we really are picking the details that matter. Because if we're focusing on the wrong details, now we're taking away from the other details that play a far bigger aspect.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, there's only so much bandwidth you can do. I remember thinking about that quote, and I know it's gained some kind of popularity. Like I think Strength Coach Network is like blown it up a little bit too with Lima and Care were going off on some of those things. And it's you're right. Like you can't focus on every single detail. Like you could sit there like this morning if I'm cleaning out my truck and I go to vacuum it and I'm there for an hour and a half, like detailing it, and then I'm trying to get every single piece of sand out of it. Is that really gonna like determine like how well my training session and how well I coach this afternoon? If I can't like if there's one speck of sand in there, like no, there's a give and take to everything we talked about. We talked about like having like that arousal zone and finding like what is too much and what is not enough. And the same with like the layup lines too. Like you want that type of reaction, but how can you channel it differently? Like you'd rather have it where you'd rather it be there than it not be there at all. And you just need to find that middle ground where you're at least reacting to it. And now can we react to it in the right way? And yeah, you can't focus on every single detail. You just need to focus on the ones that really matter. It's the same as KPIs. It's the same as stuff that is we talked about is going to be closer to a 1-to-1. What is the stuff that actually matters? And that is actually going to put us in a position to be successful. And let's focus on those things rather than distract ourselves with like all the plates being up in the same direction. Like if that's one thing you want to do, that's fine, but everybody needs to know why you're doing it. Everybody needs to follow it. And there needs to be a purpose behind it versus just, well, it looks nice. Like there's got to be a lot more to it than just say, well, if they do this, it'll mean a win. I don't buy behind that at all either. So hey, kind of shift gears a little bit too, because talking about a lot of the training that you end up doing with your athletes, like on the flip side, like getting into the profession, you talked about like some of the injuries that you kind of underwent when you were in high school that kind of really drove you to, hey, I want to kind of see how to get out of maybe some of these circumstances and maybe help athletes prepare themselves better so maybe they won't have the misfortune of having to go through surgery or go through those things. How'd you kind of deal with some of those injuries and like how did your mindset shift as you were kind of coming off like that ankle injury or anything else you kind of sustained? And then what did your training kind of shift to after high school when you're maybe not involved at sports at the same degree, like on a team atmosphere anymore?
Man, looking back on it, one thing that stands out to me was all the things that I chose poorly with in my rehab process in high school, and just the importance of why that kind of guidance from a really good physio and a really good strength and conditioning coach matters. Because I broke my ankle, I had surgery on it in May after the state track meet, and that would have been 2015, I think. And had the surgery, was in a boot on crutches for the good majority of the summer. But then looking back on it, the rehab process for me, how many times was I actually having an impact with the ground and having to create something out of that? How many times did I actually put myself in a position where I might fail with this? Or was it just, well, I'm doing rehab and any rehab's better than nothing. And so by the time football rolls around, I'll just be good to go. It'll be magically good. And that was such a faulty way of thinking from me. Because I would specifically remember, got out there for that first football practice of the fall, laced it up, tried to do some stuff. And I knew within the first 10 seconds that I was not going to be playing football that season. That's how terrible it felt doing that, because I was not ready for it. And no shock, I wasn't ready for it. I didn't do as much in the rehab process that was actually going to help me recover and get ready for the sport. And I think strength and conditioning and physical therapy kind of have the same overarching mindset, but take two different sides to it. Strength and conditioning is push, 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 get through, get through, get through. And then you've got your PT normally who's like, pump the brakes, let's do this. And there's such a middle ground you have to find. Because if you're never uncomfortable, if you're never having pain in that rehab process, that's probably not a good thing, because that probably means when you get back to doing the thing that you enjoy, that's when it's going to pop up. And that was exactly my experience. I did none of the cutting, sprinting, acceleration, jumping over my rehab process. And then I did nothing but that first practice back for football. And it was miserable. And it's not saying that you absolutely need to kill yourself, but you need to be able to push the limits a little bit more in that rehab process to get to that point. And so looking back on it, that was a huge thing for me that really helped me empathize now with the athletes I've got going through with rehab, whether it's an ACL or since I work with basketball, a lot of times just a sprained ankle. It's like football, you sprain your ankle, tape it up, you're back out the next week. In basketball, it's like that can end your season. If you step on someone's foot and that goes the wrong way, is that so valuable there? And being able to walk them through that process, like here's what we're doing specifically, saying, hey, this might not feel comfortable, but we need to start phasing this back in if you're going to do the thing you really enjoy, which is playing the sport. I think far too often we don't dangle the sport carrot enough. Like we just want them to be pain free. And that's not necessarily why, of course, we want them to be pain free, but we're helping them through the process so they can do the thing they enjoy the most, which is the sport. So you got to say, hey, sometimes you got to help me help you in terms of what's too much pain, what's too little pain, right? It's not saying just push blindly through it. Like the athlete needs to communicate with us on that, but saying this might not be comfortable and this might not feel super good, but this is that graded exposure. This is that tolerance up into it. I don't ask them to go run 10 miles on the first day back after a sprained ankle. It's you build up into stuff over the long run. It's making sure that that rehab process is both beneficial for them in terms of the injury and in helping them prepare for the sport itself.
Yeah, I think the key words you kind of said was it's graded exposure. And like I've seen it far too often where an athlete gets injured. You're coming off inherently whatever sport you're playing at like Division I level, like it's not inherently healthy, like what you're doing. It's not like necessarily a healthy lifestyle, like training, like if to the outside perspective, where you're talking to the layman person, like an athlete is healthy. But like what they're doing to their body, like how often they're training, like the calories are taken in, like the stress that they're undergoing to go through these things, like to be successful, like it's inherently like an overdone thing, like to actually prepare and train. So if you're coming back from a rehab setting and oftentimes some PTs are just trying to get you back to kind of a healthy, like status quo, like homeostasis kind of position versus try to get you, hey, back to the position and even be in a stronger, more capable area, like position that you were in before you got injured. So that it doesn't happen again and you're not coming back to see them again. And a strength coach, like like you said, you're pushing it while they're kind of putting on the brakes. And there's a middle ground where you can kind of downgrade it a little bit and make sure that it's inherently ramping up at the right timeline to get them back to a position where they were playing before. And unfortunate for you, like you kind of got back to the position where you're like, hey, I can't do the things that are inherent to my sport. So strength coaches kind of being more along on that rehab process, or I mean, if it ends up being where you're just kind of taking like building off of when you get them, or I think the best way is kind of be more integrated with that process. And like the physical therapist, the doctor, the athletic trainer, the strength coach, like they're all kind of on the same page. And it's a continuum where, hey, like in the beginning, the doctor's like dictating most of the thing, but everybody should still be in communication. All right, it's being passed off to the physical therapist. They're the main kind of conductor of this, but everybody still understands, like the doctor understands, like, hey, this is where they're at. It looks like they're good. They're making good progress. Okay, cool. Strength coach, hey, you're going to have this amount of time until they're going to be with the athletic trainer. Physical therapist pushes them off to the trainer. And then it just kind of works through the continuum. But at some point, like you said, it needs to be challenging. Like their sport, like when they go to practice, even though it's maybe more fun, you got to dangle that fun side of sport and getting back to it. And it's going to be kind of painful. And they're going to do some hard things in that rehab process. Because the more painful thing is you're going to get back to practice like you did and feel unprepared. And then you're going to play timid. And in some sports, you play timid, you're right back in surgery again. That's just how it works. So you gotta do rehab the right way, and it's gonna be difficult for sure, depending on that injury. Okay, so go touching base a little bit, like with the training, like we talked about, like how's your training nowadays look? Like, hopefully got the injury bug behind you, so don't have to focus on that stuff. And then kind of touch on what we didn't yet talk about. We kind of talked before we pre-recorded. You have a unique situation where you got both basketballs and wrestling, all winter sports. I don't know if I know anybody else that has kind of that setup. And like right now during this down period of summer, like the lights are basically off where you're at until everybody starts arriving. And when you're in season, you're in season. And when you're off season, you're off season because they all kind of coincide together. How's your kind of training look? And then like when it comes to some of those different seasons, since you're almost like on a one team cycle, even though you have three teams, how does it maybe differ when you guys are like in the full swing of things? Maybe you're on the road, or when you do have this amount of downtime, how does that kind of shift your schedule for you training wise?
So right now, when I have the most time, that's when I ramping my volume up, obviously. Right now, I'm actually running through, if you know who Jake Tura is, I'm running through hypertrophy clusters. Again, I have yet to run someone else's program that I've enjoyed as much as running hypertrophy clusters. For the audience, if anyone's not familiar with it, basically the concept is you double the sets and you cut the reps in half. So that way, the weight you're using over the course of the set is heavier than you normally would for whatever repetition number you were working off of, but you're able to move it faster. So you're able to build power a little bit more, and you see about the same amounts of hypertrophy. And so, if for a contact sport athlete in particular, so think your football or your hockey or those kind of things where like muscle mass matters because you're going to be taking a beating if you don't have it. Super, super successful program. And like I said, if we think about training as the best program is the one the athlete actually gets done and enjoys the most, that's the one for me that's yielded the best results because it's the one I've loved the most. So Jake Tura winds up listening to this podcast. Thank you for that program because it's wonderful. For other training goals though, while I do enjoy the hypertrophy training because I actually started off in bodybuilding, I did a NPC show and won my sort novice category there before deciding that if I was actually going to be successful in bodybuilding, you have to wind up taking steroids. And I had no interest in dying of a heart attack at age 30. So I kind of pivoted to that athletics route there. There were just more puzzle pieces with athletics. And that was very, very stimulating, but not that bodybuilding is a truly solved sport. It's far more solved than athletics. And there's way more moving pieces and less equations to it on the athletics side. And that's really, really appealing there. And so something from my own training that I've really enjoyed doing is pushing myself to be able to dunk a basketball. I'm not super tall. I'm about 5'7" right now, 190 pounds. It's going to take some effort for me to be able to dunk a basketball at that. But being able to train to push yourself, and there's something inherently. We go back to what do the athletes really, really respect? It's seeing the same things that you say you want to see out of them actually doing yourself. And so that's challenging for me. Like I'm a much stronger, stockier, strength athlete myself. If I'm going to dunk, it's going to be off two because it's not going to be off one. I'm not elastic whatsoever. My women's basketball players can attest to that. I actually play them one-on-one or in horse before their practices or as a warm-up for our strength and conditioning sessions. I have yet to win any of those. I've gotten my ass kicked frequently. Ashley Hawkins was our first team all-conference player. I have no clue how to guard her. It's incredibly difficult. I'm just put in a blender every single time. But they love seeing that because they see that you're showing them you're willing to step out of your comfort zone. But then you can explain why the training you're doing with them is doing that. And I'm very upfront with them. I'm like, the way that I really, really like to train, more of a bodybuilding or hypertrophy type style, is not the same stuff I'm doing with you. So when I get my ass kicked when we're playing one-on-one, I'm not always doing the exact same stuff as you. So don't take that as, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing if he can't do it himself kind of deal. But right now, once kind of hypertrophy cluster is done, I'm going to shift a little bit more back towards exclusively training to dunk. And so I'm going to drop a little bit of muscle mass there and really emphasize more of the plyos and sprint type training. And that's one where, if you're familiar with the name Matt McInnes Watson, he might be the coach that I have most modeled my programming after. And he runs plus plyo. So if you're not familiar with what that concept is, basically he coaches a full foot landing, being active in that landing, building up that pre-activation to contact the ground, and being able to do it across the different tiers. So we've got light, medium, deep, and ping tier, and it fits what you see everyone doing in athletics. And so running through all those different things and being able to learn that myself, it builds that buy-in. I think, again, coming at it from the athlete's perspective, like I'm stronger than all my basketball athletes. They know that. I know that. Just super simple there, right? Different athletic builds. They're not super impressed by strength, right? Is that a lot of times they just view it as it's just a complete opposite of what my sport actually is. But I go out there and I demo the ping hops that we're doing, where you're getting up as high as you can, as fast as you can on one leg repetitively. That's when they're like, you can see their eyes get a little bit like, how on earth can he actually move like that? And then all of a sudden you see it. Like when we do those, you can see the buy-in. Like no one wants to mess that up. They're like, well, if he's able to do that, I got to be able to do this. I'm the Division I basketball player here. And so you reinforce not only that learning model, but they see you actually doing the things that they're really, really good at. And then they want to get better at that thing. So I think one of the things that my training has, or coaching basketball has most influenced my training more than the other way around, is now I'm adding more of the stuff I'm coaching them in just because I want to be better at the thing. And over the course of the semester, watching how their hops progressed, they gave effort and saw there, but they saw me doing it at least at a decent level in order to try to replicate it, right? But them seeing, hey, he actually can do the things he wants us to do, and he can explain to us how it's going to translate into the game. And obviously, once they surpass me at it, like the door is shut just because they're far better athletes than I am. But that buys in massively for them, just actually being able to see that done.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Like we try to reiterate that stuff with our younger coaches and our interns and volunteers. Like one of the best ways to kind of like get your foot in the door and build some buy-in, even if you don't even open your mouth, like is be a great demoer. Like athletes inherently are visual. They want to see it done. You could sit there and explain it and think like, why don't you guys understand? But once you actually like get on the court, like you grab a bar and you kind of demo it so they can see it, and then you can kind of touch on some of the finer points or answer questions and stuff like that. Like it start to make more sense in their mind. And then when you start talking about like, hey, well, this is how I train, and inherently I'm not a great basketball player, but I can demo these things. Imagine what you can do if I'm giving a program that is designed for you as a basketball player, and you learn how to do these things with the skill you already possess. Like then they start put, like you said, they start putting those puzzle pieces together and they're like, you know what, if this is the thing I'm missing, that'll up my game. And I'm going to put more emphasis on this stuff because it's relatable. It's going to benefit me on the court. So this is where I really want to put my focus in. And that's where, like we talk about, like that's where the important details come in. Like some of the other stuff is wishy-washy. We don't need it. You don't need to like go through some of the hypertrophy clusters with them necessarily. But you start doing stuff that ties in and they find importance, and like you got them like hook, line, and sinker for like the training. So no, that's a cool concept. And it's definitely awesome to like get out there and kind of be a little bit of vulnerable and be in a position where you're playing some of the players too, because it gives you a chance to kind of showcase like the things you're working on, but shows you like, hey, again, my program is not what I give you guys. Like they're two separate things. I'm putting some of like my biases into the program based off what I think is going to benefit you, not stuff to validate like my own like favorite exercises or movements and stuff like that. So no, that's awesome. And I'll have to check some of those things out too. I've heard a lot about Jake's program too, and I know it's getting a lot of good reviews. So maybe that's something to run in the off season at some point. So, hey, Nat, like any good training session, we end the show with a finisher. So I got 4 quarters, 4 questions, and good old fashioned overtime for you. So you can go rapid fire and you can try to shoot these quick from the hip, or you can any of them take your time on them and feel free to expand. But you ready?
Let's do it.
All right, first one I got for you. Biggest influence in strength and conditioning.
It has to be Matt McKinnis Watson, just based off the body of work that he's put into his plyo system and how much I've utilized it. That's basically my starting framework is all right, I've got these I'm trying to work in. How do I build the rest of the session around that instead of any other? So McKinnis Watson.
All right. Hey, so when you're not coaching, not competing, you got this kind of perfect down period between all your winter sports kind of being away for right now. What are some of your go-to hobbies that aren't strength and conditioning related?
My wife and I really like finding new places to eat, and so we go to Charlotte pretty frequently. Because Charlotte's about the very very west end of Charlotte. It's like 45 minutes from us. So go in there pretty frequently. We also got a young puppy, so we enjoy taking her outside, finding some spots in the park. Also double beneficial there because then she just sleeps a lot better later that night. So those two hobbies, number one.
All right. Hey, so if you weren't coaching, what do you think you would be doing as a profession right now? And if you could go pro in any sport, what would that be?
Oh man, if I wasn't coaching, I'd probably choose something in the medical field, probably like a rad tech or something like that. That just seems oddly fascinating to me. I don't know why. I can't even explain it, but something about that just seems like that would be fun. Like trying to decipher how you're actually reading what you're reading on the X-ray. If I could go pro in one sport, I think the sport that, not just saying this because I have the basketball teams, the sport that fascinates me the most is basketball from that perspective. It's because they are such outliers from the general population. I saw this stat the other day, and this is more exclusive to men's basketball. But if you're in the United States of America and you know someone who's 7 foot tall or more, there's like a 17% chance they're in the NBA at that moment, which just blew my mind that almost one out of every five, like 7 footers in the US is in the NBA. And it really just makes you appreciate just how freakishly athletic those guys really, really are. That, and I think it's the sport where there is the finest balance between the skill aspect of the sport and the physical tools that they have. If we think about football, is just a lot more general physically. There's less of that inherent skill component within the sport versus something like an NBA basketball game or a WNBA basketball game, where there's a really, really fine motor skill they're trying to have developed while also having to be able to basically do plyometric sprints and decelerations for a full 48 minutes if that's what they're playing, or 40 minutes if you're at the college level. That I think is such an underrated aspect. So I think if you took your average general population person and said, all right, you're going to have to play a full game of one of these sports, I think the worst one for them would probably be basketball. Because if they had to play a full 82 game season, can you imagine that? Like they'd all be on IR within the first week. Like they might survive that first game. And then that second game, when they have to play on Wednesday after a Monday, it's just that injury rate's going to go through the roof. So basketball for sure.
All right, all right. Hey, so setting up an ideal training day for yourself. Like if you got some heavy hypertrophy clusters coming up, or you got a quick session you got to get done before a team comes in. what's playing through the stereo and what is like your post-training meal, like hands down best one look like?
Oh man, music, honestly, if I got my headphones on, something like Party Next Door, or I do enjoy Kendrick Lamar. Rap Beef definitely helped that out because that gives some great plays there in the gym. But once I'm done, I'm a classic protein shake guy. I don't want to have my big meal right after that. Key is to get like your optimum vanilla flavored whey protein and then mix somewhere between 1 to 1.5 cups of Fruity Pebbles in there. But you mix it the night before and you let it sit overnight in the fridge. That's hard to beat because then it just tastes like Fruity Pebbles milkshake the next day. So that 100%.
All right. That's a new one, you got to try for sure. Hey, so last one I got for you for overtime. What is your favorite method, or who is your kind of go-to resource when you're thinking about continuing education and kind of sharpening the sword? Is it a person? Is it a book? Is it a quote? Like where do you go for inspiration or trying to improve yourself?
I love Twitter. I think Twitter is the best social media platform for strength and conditioning. I think in Instagram, there's good content out there. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot of times that gets a little bit more of the theatrics, and then you get focused on the wrong details. Like you might not even click on it if just the front of the uh, post doesn't catch your eye on Instagram, right? Versus on Twitter, there's inherently just a little bit more nuance there in what you're able to put out on the platform. And it's much more conducive to actually having those kind of conversations if people are going to reply to you or you're going to reply to someone else. And so a bunch of strength coaches on Twitter that I really appreciate following. I really like Matt McInnes Watson, Jake Tura, obviously. Dominic Walker, who's at Mississippi State, he puts great content out there. Always enjoy seeing posts from him. I think his name's Colin Corcoran at University of Miami. Another guy that puts great content out there. I just recently followed Hunter Eisenhower, who's with men's basketball at Arizona State, putting great content out there. And I think that's such an important thing is when we're going out there and we're looking for how we're going to sharpen our skill sets, you want to look within the profession first, and then you kind of want to refine it around the scientific edges elsewhere. Because we both know there's a very big gap between practical application and what maybe a textbook might say, right? And so you've got to actually find out if what someone is saying is the best way to do things is actually able to be done in that setting. And if it's not able to be done in that setting, then I don't want to go down that rabbit hole anymore because it's not going to help me out, you know? And so looking at what all those other coaches are doing and being able to fit in those puzzle pieces and then rounding out those edges. Like, all right, if they're doing this, does what they're saying match up scientifically? Maybe there's a slightly different way of doing things, but then like those guys I just listed, like they're at a really, really high level of what they're doing. And so a lot of times there, it's just like, I really like this concept. This checks out both practically because you're doing it at a really high level. This checks out scientifically with what research is saying. It's a really, really good method. And you know, it's not like you just run whatever they're doing, but you're able to build in those kind of things. And I think it really, really helps not being protective of whatever you're running in strength and conditioning. I think part of the problem with our perception amongst sport coaches and the general public is some strength and conditioning coaches seem almost reluctant to share what they're doing or give a deeper dive into things. And if we're going to complain about our pay and our hours and then hide up in our own secret hole and only converse amongst ourselves, well, it's no wonder we're not getting paid. We're solving all these problems athletically, but no one has a clue that that's actually happening. And you're not putting anything out there for them to see. And so if you're doing quality training, put it out there. Let people see that. Like this is what goes into creating strength and conditioning for Division I basketball. Here's the boxes we're looking to check. Here's the problem we see with the athlete. Here's our anecdote on how to solve it. or anecdote, I mean, not anecdote, but you got to be able to show your value if you eventually want to really get paid at the high level that you're at. Because if you have really, really good performance and nobody knows what problem you're solving, it doesn't matter. But if you have a really, really unique problem that you're solving, your sport coach sees it, and other people see it, it's more likely you're going to get compensated accordingly, just because people can actually see the value in it. And so something like what I'm doing with the jump mats here to try to do that, I think that's valuable for other strength and conditioning coaches that might not necessarily be as data driven or tech heavy. Hey, here's our key performance indicators. Here's how I want to be judged on this, because I don't want to be judged off of just, does the coach like me for my personality, which was a lot of times what strength and conditioning coaches are compensated off of, is how well does the coach actually like you kind of deal. I want to be held to that standard where I'm saying, here's our key performance indicators, grade me based off of that. So if we don't do well at those, then terminate me, then move on to somewhere else. But if we leave everything super, super arbitrary and just, does he or she like me, really, really hard to do anything with that. And so to tie it in, like what Dominic Walker posts, and he's posting his force plate data of trends over time. He's saying, here's our programming style. Here's how we're seeing benefit in it over the long run. Now you're quantifying what you're doing. Now you're putting it out there so that your sport coaches see it, the general public sees it. And that's how you really elevate the field, by kind of putting everything under the microscope there and letting people see that, instead of wondering what you're doing all day. Because I mean, I'm sure we can all think of examples where a sport coach is like, so now that the season's done, like, what do you actually do all day? If they have to ask that question, that means they don't know what you're doing, and you haven't done a good enough job of actually explaining why what you're doing is separating you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's kind of a lot to unpack there, but it's like getting all that information out there and kind of being at the forefront of, hey, this is what we do, this is how we do it, these are the measurements we're taking. All those things are pretty important, versus like, hey, just how well do you get along with the head coach? How well do you get along with players? Those things are important at the same time, but like, yeah, actually getting the metrics out there so you can see like how things are progressing and being judged based off of what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis and the development you're making with the athletes. That's huge. I like what you talked about too. Like when you go in for something and you're looking at what another coach is doing, rather than kind of look at the research and like look what other people have done and see if it'll work in the weight room. You're doing the opposite. Like, hey, what are people already doing in the weight room? Let me see if the science actually backs that up. And then not just taking that approach and implanting it where you're at, but rather, hey, how does it actually, can I do that here? Does it apply to my players? Like, how would I have to tweak this, knowing that it's scientifically sound? It's anecdotally someone is doing it already and I see it and I enjoy it. And I think that would get a good buy-in with our players. But how can I make sure that it fits our system versus just try to take theirs and put it with a different logo here? So, hey, those are all great points for anybody looking to kind of sharpen the sword and like build their skill set and their repertoire. So I appreciate it. Hey, man, this was a lot of fun. For anybody that's got any questions for you, want to pick your brain a little bit more, follow along when you guys get ready for your upcoming season, where can they follow you and get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Twitter, now X, or Instagram, and I'm just at Nat Sauberan on both of those.
Awesome. Well, hey, like I said, I appreciate you taking some time, knowing that right now for us recording this, it's in the summer and you got a little bit of extra time before things kick into high gear, but it's been fun, man. I appreciate you coming on today, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Strength Game. Thank you again to this week's guest and to our sponsors. Be sure to connect and keep up with our guests at the links in the description below. Remember to subscribe to us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast provider to stay up to date on all future episodes. Also, check us out on YouTube and CoachO'Brien.com, where you can find all the video versions of these episodes, as well as show notes, episode schedule, and much more. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome and appreciated. Thanks again for tuning in, and be sure to join us next week for another great episode of The Strength Game.